look on the power. Oh, there we go, recording. I was wondering about that. I was going to ask. Okay, so you can go here to the link, which is on my website, and then the PowerPoint is the very first thing there. And I'll also share it, but some people like to do it on their own. Let me see. So my talk today is a little bit of a transition, and the epistemology comes in at the end, but I think it deserves its home here in an epistemology and ethics conference. So this is a kind of pandemic project. See, can everybody see the PowerPoint? Okay. Things change their orientation when I'm sharing. All right, and you can hear me? Yes. Okay, good. So this is a pandemic project of sitting and watching the world burn in 2020 and trying to figure out what sorts of narratives and interpretations I should be taking. And I found myself plagued by a lot of questions. And so this paper is an attempt at clarifying what kind of ethical and epistemological considerations go into interpreting the actions of others, and particularly what I'm going to call a contested action. So these are the kinds of actions that I think are ripe for interpretation. So is she grandstanding or merely animated and sincere? Is this group rioting or are they protesting? Was she acting out and seeking attention, or was her outburst just an attempt to express her individuality and break free from socially oppressive norms? Did this student not turn in work because they're lazy and unmotivated, or because of crippling anxiety and depression? Does the leader give a speech of hope and unity, or is he just blathering on about wishful thinking? And is this man flexing his privilege and entitlement, or is he merely asking for a fair hearing? This is just sitting in my house watching the world burn in 2020. And in these kinds of cases, oh yeah, and am I overreacting or is he gaslighting me? How should I understand this situation? In these kinds of cases, I think that there is a contested action. So I'm going to understand a contested action as that there is agreement on the basic form of the action. Certain bodily movements were performed, but there is not agreement on the significance or moral status of those bodily movements. So we agree on a certain level of description of what happened, but then there is a great deal of contention in how we might understand the nature of those bodily movements. And I think the task of interpretation is important. We can't just be purely agnostic here, because which interpretation we adopt will determine which reactive attitudes, if any, apply. And I think we wrong another person when we fail to treat them as we ought. So if we should be praising them for their bravery, and instead we are blaming them for their foolishness or their recklessness, that's going to create a rift in our interpersonal relationship. So I think that the project of interpretation is an important ethical task, and I'm going to come back to this again. Okay, so here is, I have your pictures in my way. There we go. I'm going to get rid of you guys, so now I can't see you. Here's the plan for this talk. I want to talk about understanding action and the role of interpretation and motivating why I think this is an important project that we have to undertake. Not we as philosophers, though we as philosophers too, but we as human beings. And then I want to dance through some philosophical literature, some of which is maybe more relevant than others, in order to kind of get a sense of what sort of answer we should give. And then I'm going to turn to the work of Simone Weil and talk about the intellectual virtue of attunement, which is where the epistemic stuff comes in. And then I'm going to give some concluding thoughts. So that's the plan. Here we go. All right. So what is an action? I'm going to distinguish between a mere act, some series of bodily movements, the body moved in some way, from an action, which is a description of the act that includes the agent's reason for acting. So both Korsgaard and Anscombe and many others in this neo-Kantian tradition make a big deal about how there's a description of the action that includes the agent's reasons for action, the thing that the agent saw as good in acting. And then we have this question about interpreting an action, which involves situating it within its broader meaning, settling not just what happened, which act or action was performed, but also the ethical and interpersonal significance of that act or action, like what it means for us. Okay, so why are actions contested? There's a lot of reasons for this, one of which is that information is missing. We just don't know what their motive was, or we don't know exactly what kind of context they were acting against, or what sort of information they were responding to when they performed that action. This happens a lot on social media. If you've ever been like, here's a thread and it's like about philosophy, and then Uncle Gene just weighs in like, hope you're doing well, sweetie. And you're like, what was he thinking? Why did he say that? Right. So sometimes you just don't really understand the context against which that person is performing your action. And it could be that there are just many equally good epistemic ways of filling out this answer. Like there's competing hypotheses about what it was the person was doing, and you don't have any reason to prefer one over the other. But I think that it's not merely an epistemic question. Sometimes it's a question of which concepts should be applied to the situation. So there's a contested understanding. We don't know whether we should consider this to be a riot or a protest, because it's contested which one would be properly applied to the situation. And that is itself going to be embedded in deeper questions about what the difference between a riot and a protest. So there are cases where the conditions of applying the concepts themselves are contested. You see this in the debates over, what is a woman? And then there are conditions where applying the concepts are vague. So there's all kinds of ways in which it could be contested because our language is not quite precise enough. And I think these are the most serious and difficult ones, there's a case of a clash of evaluative outlooks. So according to one evaluative outlook, the action is appropriate, even required, and according to another, it is foolish. And I'm using the term evaluative outlook from Scanlon and Tal Brewer, who describe it as sort of a holistic way of thinking about the goodness or rightness or appropriateness of some aspect of reality. So I had this experience, I will admit, reading Antigone, and Antigone is given this impossible choice of either, burying her brother and dying, or not burying her brother and living. And she's just like, oh, what will I do? I will bury my brother. I can't do otherwise. And it's like, for someone who doesn't understand the importance of honoring the dead and giving them a burial so that they will have an afterlife that is worthy of them, you could think, girl, just don't do it, right? In order to understand the significance and the importance of her action, you have to understand the significance and importance of burying the dead, according to Antigone's worldview, according to her evaluative outlook. And these occur all the time in our very polarized world, which I hate using that phrase because it's overused, but we do have one. And so we encounter a lot of times where an action that seems required according to one evaluative outlook seems foolish according to another. And then there are interpretations that arise out of narratives, of ways of thinking about the world and situating various seemingly disconnected facts into a story arc. And there are robust stories that explain the nature of the action. However, I do not think it's promising to ask, how do we settle what action was performed in a contested action by just looking to the narratives, because narratives can be minted on the cheap. That's what the prognosticators on television do when they tell you a story about how actually the latest administration's actions were perfectly good or perfectly bad, according to a narrative, which I'm now going to make out of thin air. So while I think a lot of times we make sense of actions within narratives, we can't look to the narratives themselves. Though I have another paper trying to, but it's not finished yet. Okay, understanding action. So why should we care about interpretations? I don't know. I'm like on board. Like once you're like, yes, this is an important thing, but some people are not, and they think, who cares? Just suspend judgment forever. And this, I think, may work if you're a scientist about your theory, but it does not work in a marriage. So the quality of our interpersonal relationships depends on adopting interpretations. You can't just suspend forever whether it was appropriate or inappropriate to, perform some action when it's with somebody you live with. They will be like, no, you have to make a call here. And furthermore, I think it's a matter of justice for our interpersonal relationships that we don't give everyone a pass because, oh, we can't settle whether this was gaslighting or the person is unreasonable. It really matters to the quality of to their status within the community, that we can recognize who was wronged and who was the perpetrator of wrong. And also, and this comes from David Velleman, I think we're driven to understand each other, to be mutually intelligible. And it's not just an idle curiosity, but it's a deep need we have, that our actions are intelligible to each other and to ourselves. And so adopting interpretations about our actions is something that we're driven to do. It's not something we can just put off forever. And we have strong social need to have shared interpretations of significant events and actions. Things that make things unintelligible are actually really difficult things, whereas you can see after a great tragedy, people come together to find an interpretation of what happened so that they can make sense of it and grieve. And when it can't be made sense of, it makes the grieving process even more difficult. And here, my go-to is often these mass shootings where we have no intelligible narrative that makes sense of it. It just seems like a mindless evil. So we have this need, and when it is not filled, it creates a gaping hole in our experience. So I think that the interpretive task is fundamentally an ethical task of seeing others justly. And I do want to put a little pin in here and say there's all kinds of other interpretive projects you might have. Like you might have a scientific interpretive project, you might have a historian's interpretive project, which may or may not be the ethical task. There's many different kinds, but the one that I am interested in is this ethical task of seeing others justly. Okay, so here's the question for this talk. In a contested action, how should we settle on the meaning of an action, or what should guide us in coming to an interpretation? Okay, so the first thing of the plan is now done. Understanding action and the role of interpretation, why it matters. Now we're going to dance through some philosophical literature, then we'll continue on. Okay, here's the dance. So here's one view that seems like a good place to start. I'm going to call this the authority view. It comes from Anscombe. So Elizabeth Anscombe, in her great book, Intention, great and puzzling book, Intention, writes that an agent knows what she's doing without inference, expressed via her intention. And so a natural thought, this is not what Anscombe says, but a natural thought would be, so we ought to defer to the agent to understand the meaning of her action. We ought to take the description of the action that is the agent's description of what she is doing and hold that as the default for settling the interpretation. And I recently read Anscombe, and she uses this about the description of the action that matters morally and ethically. So I think you can see that this is a very promising idea. I just admitted somebody into the room. Hello. Okay. So the intention, according to Anscombe, expresses the agent's reason for action. It expresses what it is that she thinks she's doing. And we might think agents have privileged access to their intentions. We don't have to think it's infallible, but it's better than what we have. And so if we want to know what the person is doing, we should just look at the description under which they think they conceive of themselves as acting. And this kind of deference is grounded in epistemic and moral reasons. The epistemic consideration is just that the agent has better access to her intentions in acting than we do. For all her mental states. And the moral consideration is that respect for agents involves, in part, seeing them as determined by their reasons. So if they know what their reasons are in acting, and we should respect them as determined by reasons, at least in some kind of peaceful way, then we should just defer to the description of the action that the agent would provide. I think this is not particularly helpful in the kind of cases I'm interested in. The first is one that any interest student could come up with, which is that agents can be self-deceived, and especially in the kinds of actions that I'm interested in, like, am I being unreasonable or is he gaslighting me? My internal description of the action is perhaps not a good guide because ego might be at stake, or I might be not have sufficient ego. So that seems like a little bit problematic. But the bigger question, I think, is that the intentional description of the action is not sufficient for the meaning of the action. So one example is not recently now, 2020, the former governor Northam of Virginia, a photo surfaced of him posing in blackface, and he was like, oh, well, I didn't mean anything by it. I was just, so he gives his intentional description of the action. And the reaction, by and large, and I think rightly, is it doesn't matter. You still did something problematic, and it's problematic because of all of this historical and social background that makes that action inherently disrespectful, no matter what you thought you were doing with it. That does not determine the kind of reaction. The fact that you had a good intention does not determine the kind of reaction we should have to you. And I think it also doesn't work very well for these what you should have known or what you should have done. It only explains what you did do. And so while I think that the intentional description of the action is a good starting point for interpreting action, it isn't sufficient, because there can be a lot of things going on in the background that the individual is either not aware of or doesn't care about or failed to consider. Okay, I'm just going to give a couple examples of ways in which I think this is insufficient. So first is just the negligence case. If the individual fails to be attuned to the morally significant features of the situation, their intentional description of the action may be perfectly well-meaning, but it doesn't mean that they're not to be blamed, that we shouldn't have the reactive attitudes of abhorrence or blame, repugnance, whatever. Another could be narcissism. The agent is guided by a vision of the good, but it's all in reference to a misplaced centrality of the self. So of course it makes them look good, but it's not quite what's called for. They could have an improper narrative. So they're guided by a narrative that assigns significance to her actions as good, but they're inept in the social context or the underlying needs of those around her. So she has a savior complex and she's saving everyone. And we interpret that as misplaced rather than just the description she would say. You could have a bad evaluative outlook. So according to your evaluative outlook, you're doing the right thing, but we can see that that is actually a misplaced sense of what you ought to be doing. So we don't just want to say like, oh, you were doing a good thing because you thought you were doing a good thing. And of course, ignorance and Sartrean freedom, which I'm going to skip over because, well, interesting, not necessarily relevant. All right. So on the one side we have, let's just defer to the individual. On the other side of this spectrum, you might think our actions, the meaning, the significance of them are just determined by social convention. So I'm going to call this the social meaning view. And it goes something like this. The meaning of the action is just determined by available social scripts, schemas, and blueprints. So action A just means M in circumstances C. So when Northam, for his picture, wore blackface, and I realize that for an international audience, maybe it doesn't quite capture how offensive it is to wear blackface, but it's very offensive. In the circumstances, it just is offensive, and it doesn't really matter what he thought. We don't have to look to his intentional description of the action. We just know based on the social script that that's going to be offensive. There's a lot of actions that are going to be like this, like wearing a wedding ring, liking an Instagram post, saluting one's commanding officer. They just have the meaning that they have, and while we could negotiate different meanings for these actions, in a given context, it's just not up to the individual what the action means. That just is what it means. These views are put forward by people like Christina Bicchieri and Sally Hasslinger, and I don't want to deny that there is social meaning or anything like that. However, I do want to deny that we should just defer to the social meaning of an action. Contested actions in particular often have multiple social meanings, or sometimes it's an open question which script or schema we should use to understand what was done. And in addition, social scripts are in constant need of critique because their meanings are unjust or obfuscatory. They don't allow right relationships to be maintained. So this happens in the phenomenon of silencing, where nothing a woman says can be taken up within the conversational context. This was a really horrific example from a few years ago with some fraternity, I think at Yale, being like, no means yes and yes means anal, right? No matter what the woman says, it has a meaning. It means she is available, no matter how much she would try to resist that. And I think what that shows is that we shouldn't just defer to the social meaning. We should be willing to critique it and say, even though the social context says it means that, it's wrong, it's unjust. I also have examples of hermeneutical injustice and hermeneutical obfuscation, where it's really unclear because we don't have the relevant conceptual resources what is taking place. And so the paradigmatic example here is sexual harassment. Without the concept of sexual harassment, we can't really understand a particular action as having that significance and requiring the kinds of responses that it in fact requires. Okay, how am I doing on time? All right, we can do this. So I have a lot to say about the principle of charity. I'll say a little bit, but I'm basically going to say boo charity. So there's a thought that goes right through the philosophical literature. Aquinas and Kierkegaard give particularly poignant descriptions of this, but also the doxastic wronging literature, it comes out, which is that you should defer to the interpretation of the other person that makes them look better. Aquinas, I don't think I have the quote here, but Aquinas has this quote that says, better to interpret someone as being a person of goodwill and be wrong most of the time than to occasionally be wrong and interpret them as not being a person of goodwill. So the idea is we should over attribute the good motives to the other people. Kierkegaard has this view, like if we treat people with a love, then they will eventually become that way. The idea is it's so bad to get it wrong about that person, and this comes up with the waiter case too, that we should defer, we should just be overly charitable and be wrong more often because it's so bad to get it wrong in the cases we would be wrong. So we interpret the person as acting from goodwill whenever possible. I think charity is not at odds with truth. I just think it's a bad interpretive principle. For one thing, it ignores harms to third parties. It makes predatory behavior invisible because you're going to be like, well, it could be innocent, could be not, could be well-meaning. It never allows for ulterior motives in seemingly innocent situations. And so it's going to allow for grooming to be like, not only that you never are allowed to suspect it, but like the groomer could even know this and exploit it. It ignores the importance of self-protection. So if you imagine, this is an example from Eric Weiland, you're on a date and you start thinking, is this person creepy? If you had the principle of charity, you'd have to be like, no, that's a bad thought, push that down. They're not creepy. I don't have enough evidence yet. And I think the reaction I have to that is like, if you start asking whether they're creepy, you can just act on that, right? You don't have some duty of charity to pretend like to put yourself in harm's way because you're worried they might be creepy. In fact, you should be able to act on that. And it's dubious that the rosy glow of partiality spurs moral improvement. This is on Kierkegaard, which I'm happy to talk about in Q&A if you're interested. There's other things about charity which I can talk a lot more in Q&A. So I think a principle of charity is in fact not what is required. Is it more charitable to view the person as vastly irrational or to view them as acting from a bad will? So sometimes when you are trying to interpret someone, it's like, well, they're either really, really irrational or really, really bad. Which one is the more charitable thing? Do you think being irrational or being bad? And it's not totally clear which one it will be. I'm not going to really argue for this. I'm just going to propose. I think that instead what we need is an interpretive principle of justice, not charity. So as I said before, the interpretive task is an ethical task, and we interpret in order to understand. Our understanding is guided by the aim of living in right relationship with others. And so I think what's required here is the interpretive principle of justice, which might involve charity towards people in certain situations, but it's always going to involve balancing the interests of everybody involved in the situation, not just the one person who you might need to be charitable towards. So the question is, how do we do that? How do we have an interpretive principle of justice if charity, authority, and social meaning, I didn't talk about intelligibility, are distorting in the ways that I've discussed? Okay, so the answer is to cultivate the virtue of attunement through the practice of attention. All right, so here's where we are. We talked about action, the role of interpretation, talked about some philosophical literature. I pointed out its shortcomings. Now we're going to talk about the cognitive virtue of attunement from the work of Simone Weil. So Simone Weil was a philosopher from the first bit of the 20th century. She died in 1943. And she thinks of this, she thinks of interpretation as a contemplative rather than a constructive task. We're not trying to create what the other person was doing. We're contemplating or being focused on the particularities of the action itself. So we ought to interpret each other by paying attention to the features of the action, the agent, the situation, and especially, and this is where I find Weil's work really instructive, our relationship to each, the way in which we are reading things into the situation. So through the practice of attention, by paying close attention to what actually happens, we develop this virtue of attunement. So in Gravity and Grace, which is basically her journal that was published after she died, she writes, "We have to try to cure our faults by attention and not by will. If we turn our mind towards the good, it is impossible that little by little the whole soul will not be attracted thereto in spite of itself. The authentic and pure values, truth, beauty, and goodness in the same activity of a human being are the result of one and the same act, a certain application of the full attention to the object." Now, there were some people being Humean earlier, so you might be like a little worried about how Platonist this sounds. But the idea here is that by being attuned to the object itself and the action that took place, it helps us strip away the ways in which distorting features become part of our interpretation. So she asks us to consider the person who is hungry and asks for food. She writes, "To know that this man who is hungry and thirsty really exists as much as I do, that's enough. The rest follows of itself. In order to ignore this man's need, we must convince ourselves that he does not really need it, or we cannot really help him. But if we're properly attuned to his need and our ability to help, we're unable to arrive at any other conclusion that we must help him." And so for Weil, the wisdom that is needed to interpret the meaning of an action is given to us through the practice of attention. We can talk about this more in Q&A. I sense it's controversial. Weil continues in thinking about the way in which her word for interpretation is reading others. We read, but are also read by others. And there are interferences in these readings. Forcing someone to read himself as we read him, the social view, slavery. Forcing others to read us as we read ourselves, conquest. So she points out there's these dangers if you defer too much to yourself, to the authority view, and if you defer too much to the social norms. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these distortions. Our personal history, our emotional reactions, our ego can distort our reading of the situation. So when we're giving our intentional description of the action, there's all these ways in which it can be clouded by our own relationship to the action. And from the social deference standpoint, there could be peer pressure, but we can also fail to take proper care to understand the other person when we just think, oh, well, this just looks like what society would call this kind of action. We fail to be properly attuned to the other person. And this in particular happens when we have contingent, unhelpful, and unkind scripts. So they can be a source of error because they're based on contingent features that may or may not track anything of value. And she gives the example of Joan of Arc, which I think is a nice one. So, of course, she was canonized as a saint in 1920, but when she was burned at the stake, she was not because she was a saint, it was because she was condemned as a witch or a heretic. And so Weil is caught up with, well, if you think social meanings are just going to determine Joan of Arc, which social meaning? Is it the 1430s, the 1920s, the 2020s? Which one is relevant? Because Joan of Arc's actions, according to the Catholic Church in 1430, made her a heretic, and according to the Catholic Church in 1920, made her a saint. And so these social understandings change. Which one is relevant for determining the meaning of the action? She thinks what this I think that what this highlights is our own role in determining these interpretations in that it's not purely dependent on the self or the social interpretation. There's actually an activity at work here. Okay. More distortions. We can be angry, fearful, self-protective. We can defer to cultural scripts rather than seeing the individual. We can defer to the mob mentality rather than weighing the details of the case. This is one where sitting in my house in 2020, I felt constantly like, I don't have enough details, but I'm being asked to make public judgments about the rightness or wrongness of all these things happening. But I don't have the details. I don't know. We can value the wrong things. We can be distracted. We don't give it proper attention. And this is one that I think Kate Mann's work brings out really well, is that the power relationships can distort our interpretations, where we feel like we have to be charitable to one party, the powerful party, and we sort of downplay the marginalized parties. Okay, so how is attunement a corrective for these distortions? First, it reveals to us the assumptions we're making about our interpretation. It lays bare how much work goes into constructing a reading, and how much of it is constructed, and makes salient the interpretive moves we're making. So interpretations of others are more fundamentally readings of ourselves, because they reflect us as much as those we read. We see ourselves in our readings. So once we recognize that we are the ones doing these interpretations, we are the ones making these assumptions, it calls us to be reflective. If we're really focused on the attention, it calls us to be reflective about our role and our values that are shaping those interpretations. The result is, I think, not a debunking of readings. It's not that the social contingency and constructedness make it any less important or legitimate. I think it helps us avoid our errors, or at least root out some of our errors. So the primary accomplishment is not that we get to the truth, though that is important when it happens, that's good, but it's that we understand our own relationship to interpretation. We understand our own limitations. So practicing attention leading to the virtue of attunement ought to bring with it increased compassion and humility in our judgments, because we realize how much of our own evaluative outlook, how much of our own cultural assumptions, how much of our own social meaning we're importing into understanding what the person has done. Finally, attunement also makes central what we take to be valuable, appropriate, respectful, and required. It puts in bold relief our normative commitments. So once we are carefully attuned to what happened and we can see the assumptions that we're making, it also puts in bold relief our normative commitments. It can draw our attention to our conception of the good and the role that normative commitments play in interpreting the actions of others. Okay, so some conclusions. Concluding thoughts. So how should we interpret contested actions? That was what this was all supposed to be about. We should attend carefully to the person, the action, and the circumstances. And by carefully attending to the details of the situation, insofar as we know them, and having humility for the things that we don't know, the moral features become salient to us. And also, I think it helps to reflect on both what the intentional description of the action might be and what the social interpretation of the action might be, and to try to pull those together in a way that is true to the underlying observation that we attend to. So the process of attention helps us reflect on potential distortions in our own interpretation and so avoid error. The practice of attention is a skill that can be improved through practice, and we can expect that by careful attention, we will grow better at interpreting the actions of others, more humble about the potential for interference and error, and more in tuned to the value and worth of the other person. Or so says optimistic me. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Amy. Excellent talk. And we already have a question from Galen. So please, Galen.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So I'm wondering if the attunement solution just denies the problem of interpretation to begin with. So I think one of the problems of interpretation is that the world doesn't just slap us in the face when it comes to social meaning. We have to interpret it. But from what I took away from attunement is that if you practice it, it's just going to bubble to the surface and you won't have to interpret things, because like the true meaning of the action will become apparent if you develop the relevant skill over time. But this just seems to be, I want to know more about the story, how to get to that point, because we still begin with which actions the person is making, because there's going to be disagreement about that. Even sometimes the very mere act itself is up for debate.
Right.
And so how it seems like almost a magical process that the true meaning will sort of come to us in this direct way if we develop the skill.
Yeah, great. So this is a wonderful question. Part of the answer has to do with why it is that we have contested actions to begin with. And I think maybe this is methodological on my point, but I think I share it with Vey and others in the tradition I'm working with, which is, if you can't tell, neo-Kantian, which is that it kind of the world comes to us chaotically, and we have a set of conceptual tools that we use to interpret the world, and it's not very good and it's not very coherent. And so there's this project that every rational being has of trying to understand and unify that picture of the world into one that could be coherent and make sense. And that is going to be a diachronic and virtue oriented sort of project. So it doesn't deny that the problem is a real problem, because it thinks we all come into the world with a real deficit of interpretation, and it is an individual task that requires virtue to sort out what the answer is. Now, one thing you might think is, why this optimism? Why doesn't this just result in relativism of like, well, you do it your way, I do it my way, and there's not really anything unified. We're constructing the world as we go along. We're not really discovering it. And that's where I like tried to be like, do we have to go all the way to Plato to be like, no, the good will shine through or not? And I actually don't want to make some kind of stronger commitment to like Platonism about the good. But I do think that there is something really fundamental that will unify, maybe not to like one unified picture, but at least the project of trying to have a unified evaluative outlook is going to lead us to converge on a lot of things. And there's certain things that we only can get ourselves to agree to by distracting or distorting. And I think this has to do with our recognition of the worth of other rational creatures, of other persons. That's something that's going to be fundamental for all attempts to unify your evaluative outlook.
All right, thank you very much. Andre, please, your question.
Hi, Amy. Thanks for the very, very interesting talk. I just wanted to ask you about your notion of attention, because I think a lot of the times we are acting together and so you're playing a football match and we're interpreting ourselves somehow.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have an over-intellectualized notion of attention, which might be Wegel's notion of attention, which I take to be similar to Iris Murdoch's notion of attention, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this seems to be maybe an over-intellectualized notion of attention. And when I think about people acting together collectively, we need some other notion of attention, which is maybe some kind of bodily attunement to others and to the situation. So I'm wondering if you feel that you need some specific notion of attention, or if you need different notions of attention for different settings, maybe a notion of bodily attention for circumstances like playing sports together, a different notion of attention for political engagements.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So Murdoch did draw extensively from Simone Weil's work. So certainly she is reading the same things I'm reading. But you thought maybe over-intellectualized. I would think maybe just her notion of attention is so deeply personal that it's not going to work for the, like we're watching a football match kind of thing. Yeah, so let me think a little bit about what I mean by attention. I think it's grounded in the particular. That's what's really one of the things that's really important. So I think in disagreement about contested actions, it often happens because people defer to abstraction about some kind of really abstract moral principle about how no action of this type could be moral, or, no person of this type could be worthy, or obviously if the person was the powerful one, they did the right thing. And so by really looking to the particular situation, we're able to see things that all the abstraction was kind of distracting us from. That's so for my example, I'm just going to give the really controversial one because one of the other things I think a lot about is the epistemology of Me Too. And I'm very committed to this thing. I don't have very many philosophical commitments that I'm like really, really committed to, but I'm really committed to this. And that is that we cannot have a generalized principle about how to treat statements that or allegations that someone makes against a perpetrator, that it is very important when we adjudicate those that we look at the particulars of the situation, that we come to understand. Now, it's not that we can't ever use like background moral principles or anything, but that it's very important to look at the statement made. And this goes against a movement that I think exemplifies what I call like the social meaning, but it's like the anti-social meaning view, being like, if a woman asserts that something has happened, you should believe her no matter what. You don't need to know anything else, you just believe her. Kate Mann has said this in multiple publications, and I'm just like, no, that's deferring to a rule that is not based on the particulars. So when I say attention, I really do mean grounded in the particulars. So if you're looking at like the attention of the football match, it's going to depend on what actually happens. So when there's a foul and there's a penalty, the thing you should do, and maybe I shouldn't say this because some people don't feel this way about sports, but you should not be like, well, my team did the foul, so clearly it was not a foul. You should look at what actually happened, and you should let that determine whether you think it was a foul or not.
Okay, that helps. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Andre. And Jamie, please, your question.
Thanks. And thanks for the talk. I mean, that's really, really interesting stuff. I'm so interested in thinking more about it. I guess I'm wondering, I sort of saw one way of interpreting what's going on in the talk is as a sort of instantiation of a more general pattern that you see in sort of arguments for particularism. So I wondered if you thought of yourself as sort of like participating in this, and you're talking about the particulars of the situation a whole bunch now.
Yeah.
I guess just like if somebody asks you for a general rule about when to tell truths, when to be honest and when to dissemble, it's very, you can probably take a tour through philosophical history and find plenty of people taking like extreme absolutist rule positions. And then I think a very sensible thing to do is sensitive adult moral practitioners to like knock those all down, say like, no, these are too simple, they're bad. And then to sort of come to the possibly unsatisfying but ultimately correct view that like we simply are not going to be able to come up with a rule to govern this activity generally that can be communicated in like an hour-long talk or something. It's going to have to be the sort of thing that you cultivate over a lifetime of careful practice and like develop virtues around things like that. And so if you're just sort of looking for like a recipe, like, sorry, like we're just not going to be able to provide anything like that. So I see that as sort of like the general response to a whole lot of or moral questions from a lot of particularists. And I wondered if you saw yourself as roughly doing something in that tradition.
Yeah. So first I want to say, as somebody who's working in the neo-Kantian tradition, that would be funny if true. But I think that, well, here's the real thing for sure, that it's going to look very particularist, which is that the kinds of things that I think our interpretations should be sensitive to are not all the same thing. It's not just rightness, but also appropriateness and reasonableness. And, there's all kinds of normative things that are going to be at play. And part of this virtue is being able to sense which ones are the right ones. And that's not a virtue that we acquire quickly, maybe not one we acquire at all. And so, of course, there's not going to be any general rule that's going to say that. But it does not stem from a general sense of like we should be particularists about everything. It's more that I think, maybe it's my views of normativity, that I think societies, cultures, communities give us these norms. Some of them suck. And it's like a really important task that we undertake to figure out whether the ones they give us are good or not. And so we can't just defer to what the community says because they might be bad. And yeah, I guess that does sound and the way in which we figure that out is by being carefully attuned to the details and the particulars. So yeah, I'll go for definitely it's a particularist view on that level, but it's not motivated by a general particularism.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. I'll put myself on the end of the queue and come back around if there's time.
Well, in fact, there's no other queue at this precise moment. Oh, there's, I think, Galen, right? Galen.
No,
Yeah, Galen,
but,
please.
but if Jamie is doing a follow-up, I don't want to disrupt the back and forth. You can go first.
Do you want to follow on that thread, Jamie? Well,
Oh, no, it's not really that connected. You can go ahead.
all right.
This is sort of an off-the-wall question, but when you brought up the principle of charity in the context of interpretation and meaning.
Galen, sorry, I'm having the same problem as Oliver was having with your microphone, please.
Sorry. When you brought up the principle of charity in the context of meaning and interpretation, my mind automatically went to the idea that you were going to talk about things like Davidson and the role that principle of charity plays in interpreting sentences and utterances.
Mhm.
Do you think there's any fruitful analogy here? Granted,
Yes. So yeah, I took that out because it's like it's a little complicated. Yes, I do think that's another strand. So this is why the dance is not very systematic. It's just a dance. It's not like a march through the literature. So there is this principle of charity where you're supposed to interpret like goodwill to people, and that goes through Aquinas and Kierkegaard and I guess a bunch of Christian theologians. But then there's this other sense that it really is about intelligibility, about maximizing their rationality. And this is the Davidson and some of the things that Mark Schroeder has said are not exactly the same, but similar about maximizing their agential contribution. And I think that on a certain level of generality, that's going to be fine, but it's not going to be helpful. So one of the questions is, okay, so you interpret them as being rational according to what you think is true, or according to what they think is true. Now with Davidson, you're supposed to be like, well, fix as many of the beliefs you can of that you attribute to them as true, and fix as many of the desires as good, and then just see how far you can go with that. And I think that there might be something helpful there, but the way in which he does it sort of is intentionally very deflationary of all of this evaluative outlook talk. So I think there's going to be a lot of questions that it's not really going to bear on, be helpful for.
I think it would be predisposed to eliminate interpretations that involve like attributing evil to people, because evil acts, presumably if we're not evil, are just going to be so different from our outlook on life that there's always going to be some more charitable interpretation.
Right. So in the longer version, I have a couple of arguments where I argue, but not to my own satisfaction, that I think that it's just not it's not going to help the question that I'm trying to motivate in this paper, because everything that all the questions about how to do a charitable interpretation according to Davidson are just going to raise the same questions for what you do. It doesn't settle how you would handle a contested action.
All right, Jamie, please.
Great. So, I mean, one thing I noticed is that a lot of the relevant costs that you're calling attention to and the relevant risks that you're calling attention to throughout this project have to do with the possibility of getting it right or getting it wrong. But it strikes me that there's also probably just what you might think of as like wrong kind reasons that bear on which interpretation to take. Like, so just as an example of this, suppose that you have a bunch of people who are in a nursing home. They're pretty secluded from society. They don't have too much time left, but they long ago participated in a war, and there's like open questions right now about how to interpret the significance of their actions in that war. You might think that you could stack the deck of this sort of case sufficiently such that there would be like really massive costs to them to getting the correct interpretation of what they did, and there's really nothing much to be gained from that, and a lot of suffering that would happen. And we could just insert an evil demon or something if we really want the costs to come out adequately high. I'm wondering if you're thinking of that kind of cost too, such that you could say like, well, one question when we're asking which interpretation to get is just like, which interpretation will it overall make the world best for like me personally to have right now, regardless of whether it's the right interpretation?
Yeah. So the guiding principle that I really just suggested I didn't defend is one of like justice. So like justice between human relationships. So the world you're asking me to imagine is one where it does no good. It does not improve the justice of our community, the relationships we have to each other, for it to come out whether these people did any kind of atrocity or not, right? And so one question is, suppose you're just a historian, right? You can't actually fix any of the relationships. You're just trying to understand. Would they have the same kinds of guiding principles as the ones where there's an ongoing thing, right? Actually, so like, I think it was very recently someone was committed for their Nazi war crimes, like 101 years old. And I think that is really significant and important to recognize like these atrocities in the past, because it's a matter of justice. But if we were to stipulate there is no justice to be had for our relationships, and then we have external reasons that might weigh on it one way or another. And there, I don't really want to say anything, because I do think, every going is a coming. there's interpretations that do not conflict with each other. You have to settle, well, which one is the one I'm interested in? I'm not a continental philosopher, but I'm sure they have great things to say about this. And so the one that I'm really interested, that I think is important for the question I'm motivating, is the ethical one. So if there was nothing ethical at stake, then I think, well, then maybe you have some other interpretive reason to think about it.
So this is really helpful. I mean, the point about justice sort of clarifies things for me, I think, because a lot of people, I think that sort of a brutal consequentialist view about like what to do isn't really compatible with like justice always being important. Like you either have to say like,
Yeah,
well,
that's
sometimes let's just go ahead and not care about justice because it's so important to keep the world going. And it sounds like the path you're taking on this conflict between justice and best results is like justice even if the world burns. Is that right?
That's right. Well, and I actually think that this is, but I think this also because it's true, right? It's not just like because I'm like justice is so important. So I was recently listening to a podcast about a murder that took place during the civil rights era in Mississippi, and they did not ever. The whole town lied about it and covered up. And for like 60 years, they were like, 50 years, they were like, it doesn't matter. Nothing good can come from knowing the truth. And then in the course of this investigative podcast, it of course came out who the other murderer was. He was no longer alive, but it was this sense of putting the thing to rest. And it had caused generations of struggle in the community because they never admitted that that's what had happened. So I think on like the way in which intergenerational trauma is perpetrated, it can always be important for this kind of justice to be recognized. But that is an empirical claim, so I'm not going to defend it on just philosophical grounds.
Cool, that's really helpful. Thanks, Amy.
All right, so Nelson, Luis, please, your question.
Sorry. Good night. I have somewhere my video. I want to make a short question of you. Do you believe, or do you think the way we form our beliefs interfere in the process that we interpret the reasons from the others' contexts to understand the others of the start? I see my video already. Okay.
Yeah, hello.
So hello. Do you believe that the way you form our beliefs interfere the way you understand the others in the context that you present in your presentations? Interfere the way it can be narcissism when you only look to your belly. You can say that. Okay, interfere that the belief is short like that. What do you think about the belief, the relationship between the belief, okay, and the attentive to attune the situations that you present? Because was one aim that you performed, that charity. Okay, what do you mean by charity? Because charity, to me, the way I see charity, it's a higher level of love. Okay, it's not seems like not terrestrial, short level, but higher. So that make trying to put out of us a must strong feelings of understanding the other, the point of view of the others, the way they see the world about us. And sometimes I think our beliefs and sometimes our selfish beliefs interfere with that process.
Okay, good. So if I could repeat back the question to make sure I'm getting it.
Okay.
You're wondering how the beliefs that we have seem to kind of trap us into a certain kind of interpretation.
Yeah.
And so how could we even get this going?
Yeah.
Yeah. And furthermore, to connect it to the charity part, our belief sets can really prevent us from engaging charitably. Yeah. So I think this is a great question. And this is actually the way I framed it was to try to get away from some of this doxastic voluntarism. And you're asking me to address this. That's good. Keep me honest. I think of this process as a kind of inquiry where we have opened the question, what is it that took place? Of course, we're going to have background beliefs that are going to make certain hypotheses more likely than others. But when we ask, which of these descriptions, contested descriptions, should I adopt? We're at least holding open for that point. So it shouldn't already be closed to us. If we've asked the question, it shouldn't be closed to us that there's at least two answers, maybe more. We can use our imaginations, come up with more explanations. But you're right that the kinds of explanations we consider are going to be ones that are determined by what we already think is likely. And that's where I actually think this virtue of attention can be generative in ways that could get us out of our rut. Because I think a lot of our beliefs tend to be these kinds of shorthands where we're just like, that's what happened, that's what happened, that's what happened. But when we really attend and we really look at what happened, we can open up and consider alternative hypotheses, more of what's going on. And this is something we get better at the more we do, which is why I hope our fourth year philosophy students are better than our first year philosophy students. So the thought is that this is a kind of intellectual virtue that requires engagement and inquiry that should open up our imagination, our ability to consider other points of view and other perspectives, even though we of course always approach it from our own perspective. We can't help but do that, but to try to sit in someone else's perspective. I know that there's a lot of empirical literature that is not very enthusiastic about this, but I stand by it.
No, I understand. I thank you, because I part one principle that our beliefs become with pre-beliefs. The pre-beliefs becomes with the culture that you inside. So the process becomes like that, and that sometimes interfere with our agreement on belief or our agreement to a different point of view of the other. That's why I make you the question.
Yeah. So this is a kind of a Kantian idea too. In Kant's essay on what is enlightenment, he thinks we should think of it from our perspective, and then we should think about from the perspective of others, and then we should kind of like go back and forth between the two until we come with some like way that incorporates all perspectives. I'm not as optimistic as he is that we are successful. I think it takes a lot of work to be successful. Yeah.
A lot. But thank you.
All right. Thank you, Nelson, for your question. And well, we've run out of questions, but that's very timely because we've run out of time as well. So thank you very much, Amy, for your very
Thank you all so much. This was really, really nice. Yeah. Thank you.
And we meet again tomorrow at 3 p.m. Thank you all.
All right.
See you tomorrow.